Hey there, you are listening to the Small Fish Big Podcast, the entrepreneurship podcast that helps small brands develop the skills they need to grow. Full of strategy, tips and advice, honest chat, and inspiring small business stories from other entrepreneurs just like you. I'm your host, Rhiannon Louden, brand and content strategist, brand photographer, and proud small business owner. I'm also a mom, a wife, and a travel, coffee, and donut addict. And I created this podcast to help bring small businesses together, to help entrepreneurs feel connected, and to share actionable information that you can use to achieve your business goals. If you're tuning in for the first time today, thanks so much for listening in. And if you are a regular listener, thank you for the support. It would be a huge help to me in growing this podcast if you could take a moment to leave a quick review. You can do that on Apple Podcasts by searching Small Fish Big Pod and scrolling down to the review section. And make sure you click subscribe to be the first to know when new episodes air. And now on to today's episode. Hello and welcome to episode 28 of the Small Fish Big Podcast. Today we are going to talk about something that I think most of us, if not all of us, have experienced at one point in our careers, and that is imposter syndrome. Yes, the dreaded imposter syndrome. I think most of us probably know what this is by now, but we are going to start out with a little chat about what exactly imposter syndrome is, how you can identify it if you're feeling it or going through it. And from there, we will move on to the most important part of the episode. How do you deal with it? So I have done a ton of reading on this topic. I have quite a bit of experience with it myself as a small business owner and also in working with a lot of other small business owners. This is a conversation that comes up time and time again. And I think it is fair to say that most of us have dealt with this at least in one point of our sort of business journey, if not regularly. It is extremely common, so much in fact that up to 90% of women in the UK admit to suffering with imposter syndrome at some point in time. And it's something that can be a little bit difficult to talk about. I know for a lot of people, they feel that if they admit it out loud, they'll seem unprofessional, or it's almost like saying it out loud makes it come true. So it's not always the easiest thing to talk about. And so I thought it was a really great topic for the podcast. And this week's episode is going to be nice and short. I'm going to keep this to a bite-sized episode. Next week's episode is going to be on the same topic, but a little bit longer. I have some interviews set up with other small business owners to share their perspective, their stories on how they got through it. And I'll be speaking to at least one, if not two, business coaches and leadership coaches who are going to talk us through their top tips for overcoming it as well. But for now, let's venture into episode 28. How to identify imposter syndrome and how to deal with it in 5 steps. So what exactly is imposter syndrome? So if we stick with the Oxford Language Dictionary definition, imposter syndrome is the persistent inability to believe that one's success is deserved or has been legitimately achieved as a result of one's own effort or skills. Basically, you think you are not good enough. I think that's probably the simplest way to put it. And this is something that is experienced by not just women, men as well, but women seem to report higher levels of imposter syndrome, and there's probably a few reasons for that. But imposter syndrome first got sort of coined as a term back in 1978 by 2 female psychologists, Pauline Clance and Suzanne, I'm probably going to pronounce this wrong, Imes, I-M-E-S. So Pauline and Suzanne were 2 psychologists who looked into this in women overall. So some professional women, some stay-at-home mums, some women running businesses. So women across the board, different ages, different ethnicities, different parts of the world. Back then, they thought that this was something that only affected women, and there have been many, many studies done since then, and we now know this is not true. Both men and women experience imposter syndrome, but women seem to experience a lot more of it than men. A lot more women report feeling this way, at least in some point in their lives or in their careers. And women also seem to have more trouble overcoming imposter syndrome than men do, which is quite interesting. I've looked up sort of some of the the reasoning why this might be. So there's lots of different schools of thought on it. Obviously the ones that would be toughest to prove would be sort of sociological. Women are in a different place in society. We know that. Yes, there's been lots of progress made, but we are still not really anywhere near equality in most parts of the world. And that could have a lot to do with it. But one of the sort of more measurable reasons behind it could be to do with testosterone. Obviously, women and men both have testosterone in their bodies, but men have much higher levels of it. And testosterone is essentially, amongst other things, a confidence hormone. So I thought that was quite interesting. I've never really thought of it that way before, but men do tend to have more confidence. I always thought that was more to do with society and the way that that we are brought up in this sort of belief system, at least in the Western world, or in most of the Western world. But it could be to do also with that, with the hormones and just a higher level of testosterone, meaning that a lot of men, not all men, have a higher confidence level than a lot of women. Could also be a sort of lack of role models. Now, when I say this, I don't mean that there are any women in there are not any women in high up positions in companies or who have successful businesses. Of course there are, but there are less female entrepreneurs than male entrepreneurs, less female CEOs. We know this, and statistically, there is only 1 in 5 businesses run by women in the UK. I don't know what the percentage is for female sort of CEOs and higher ups in companies versus male, but I imagine it's probably similar, if not even a bigger gap between the two. So if you don't see a lot of people that you relate to or identify with in higher up positions, sometimes it's hard to believe that you could ever get into those positions yourself. And I think that ties in as well to some of the studies that have been done around imposter syndrome and women of different ethnicities. So women of color and women in the LGBTQ plus minority group tend to report even higher levels of imposter syndrome. And a lot of studies have suggested that that has to do with less women that they see as relatable or like themselves in these higher up successful positions. So that's quite interesting. There's obviously a lot of psychology behind imposter syndrome. It's something that's probably been around for a lot longer than it's actually been studied, but it's definitely very prevalent in our society today. So why does imposter syndrome matter? Well, first of all, with so many of us dealing with it, it's something that almost everybody has experience with. And if you haven't experienced it yourself, if you've managed to somehow avoid that, good for you. That's amazing. But you probably know and care about someone who has experienced it or is experiencing it on a regular basis. I guess the main issue with imposter syndrome, other than it's not a very nice thing to deal with or a very nice way to feel, is that it is a major obstacle in your success, whether you are a professional in a career or whether you are trying to build up a business of your own. If you feel like you are not good enough, that's obviously going to be a pretty big obstacle in your success. I found a couple of really great articles on this topic when I was doing my research, so I will put the links to those in the show notes if you want to read up in more detail on this. I want to keep this episode short and sweet, so I don't want to go into too much detail today. So I'll put those links in the show notes, but one of the articles I found was in the Telegraph, and they spoke to a business psychologist and leadership coach called Jess Baker. And she said that in her opinion, imposter syndrome comes from a fear of failure and an anxiety of humiliating yourself. And I thought that's a really good, straightforward reasoning behind why we feel this way. Nobody wants to fail. Putting yourself out there is a scary thing. And, I want to keep this more related to small business owners and entrepreneurs because that's mostly who listens to this podcast and that's who it's aimed towards. But I mean, the same is true for professional women. Lots of the statistics in this article in particular talk about women being afraid to speak up at meetings, procrastinating tasks at work because they're afraid of what people will think of it or afraid that they didn't do a good enough job. So these things can really be applied in, any sort of professional capacity. But from a small business perspective, the psychologist I mentioned before, Jess Baker, she feels that a lot of it has to do with the fact that entrepreneurs constantly have to step outside their comfort zone. So in her experience and in her own studies and research, she's found that entrepreneurs report much higher levels of imposter syndrome than professional women, and she thinks that's a big part of it. We're constantly stepping outside our comfort zone. Most of us do a lot of jobs ourselves. We wear a lot of hats. There are going to be things that we're more comfortable with and things that we're less comfortable with, and it's quite scary to really put yourself out there and try new things. She also pointed out that as entrepreneurs, we are personally accountable for all of our successes, which is great, but we are also accountable for all of our failures. That fear of failure is just so ingrained in our human nature. It's not nice to think about failing. It's scary to take a chance when you don't know how successful you're going to be, or if it's an area that's outside that comfort zone. And the stakes feel that much higher when you feel like it's all on you. If you work for a company, so for example, maybe you work as part of a marketing team. So if you all come up with a new marketing campaign together, there's 5 or 6 of you, everybody has their specific jobs that they're good at. They don't really have to step outside their comfort zone. If that project is a success, you don't get to take as much credit for it because you were part of a team. But if that project fails, you're not as accountable because everybody was in that together. As an entrepreneur, it's the total opposite. You are personally accountable for any failure that might happen, which makes it quite a scary thing. So how do you identify when you're dealing with imposter syndrome? So I think most of us probably know what it is. I know that I have caught myself feeling that way, and it's been quite obvious that that's what it was. But there have been times where I truly thought that something wasn't good enough, or that I wasn't doing a good enough job of something, and I didn't recognize that that was me dealing with some imposter syndrome. I truly thought that was me being inadequate. So how do we identify that this is what we're going through so that we can then deal with it? So I've made a list of 5 different things that can help us identify feeling this way. So number 1, a fear of failure. So if you've got a great idea in your head, or you've been working on a big project, or perhaps you're thinking about launching a new product or service and you keep putting it off, you're procrastinating, you're not getting it out there, stop and think about why that is. Is it really because you aren't ready? Is it really because you're unsure if you want to do it? Or is it because you have a fear of failure? Number 2, if you don't speak up or put yourself forward for something, maybe one of your clients sees that they are accepting nominations for an award and they go to you and say, you should apply for this, you're fantastic at this, we've had a great experience with you, and you don't want to put your name forward. Why is that? If somebody was about to recommend you for something, or maybe you just saw that listing yourself and thought, oh, this would be a great fit, and then you caught yourself and thought, oh, I'm not good enough for this, who am I thinking that I could apply for this award? That's probably an example of imposter syndrome. Number 3, you discount positive feedback. So I know that I myself am really bad for this one. I think a lot of women in general are. Think about it even from a non-business perspective. So you meet your friend for lunch and they compliment you. You look fabulous in that dress. Your hair's looking great. How many of us, and especially women, I know I'm gender stereotyping, but I think it's a fair one, will go and say, oh, really? Do you think so? Oh, not really. I've put on a bit of weight. Or, oh, really? My hair's needing done. My roots are awful. Instead of just accepting that compliment, we find a way to put ourselves down. And I think the same can be true for business. Someone could say, see that I edited a photo of my daughter. I recently posted some photos I took of her before a ballet class in the morning, and I was really proud of them, but then I posted them and thought, oh, I don't know, are those good enough? And I got all these lovely comments from people about how the photos were absolutely beautiful. They loved the light, they loved this, they loved that. And instantly I kind of went, oh, do you think so? They were just quick snaps, and oh, I'm not sure, they're not perfect. I think we do this all the time, whether it's in our personal lives, our business lives. And right there, that's a little bit of imposter syndrome. Number 4, we dismiss our abilities. So if somebody gave you a compliment about one of your abilities, or somebody asked if you could help them with something and you went to go, yeah, I know how to do that. And then that little voice inside your head went, you don't really know what you're doing, or what makes you think you could do that? What makes you the expert? I think that's something, again, that most of us have dealt with, probably in more areas of our lives than just our professional one. But if you dismiss an ability that you know deep down you have, that is another example of imposter syndrome. And my 5th and final example is if you refuse to accept that you've done a good job. So a lot of creatives tend to be perfectionists.